The Greensboro Coliseum in Greensboro, North Carolina, a location that means so much to many professional wrestling fans, not just in the environs, but all over the world. If you've loved professional wrestling for a few decades, you absolutely get just chills hearing the name Greensboro, North Carolina, especially the Greensboro Coliseum. And why is that? The countless legends that have competed inside the hallowed halls of the Greensboro Coliseum. Absolutely enthralling thousands and thousands of fans for decades and decades. The amount of moments would take forever to list. And honestly, the amount of legends would take forever to list. It's a who's who of the history of professional wrestling, the all-time greats, and so many tremendous moments. And so many events that fans will talk about until the day they leave this earth. And until the day the earth blows up. And then we have to talk about in space. Had it not been for one particular event on November 24th, 1983, who knows if the history of the Greensboro Coliseum would be as, mythological as it is now. I actually don't even know if that's the right term to apply, but you talk about the fact that it was the idea of Dusty Rhodes and Jim Crockett Jr. You talk about the fact that it was Steamboat and Youngblood against the Briscoes, and it was Piper and Valentine in a Doge collar match. Much blood, such wow, and so many other talents on that card. But had it not been for a journey called A Flair for the Gold, where Ric Flair, the Nature Boy, would finally be crowned as the Ultimate NWA Champion, with the torch being passed from the King Harley Race. Had it not been for that, I don't know if this event would be known as the granddaddy of them all. It might have just been a one-time thing, but thankfully, because Ric Flair, truly one of the all-time greats, and Harley Race, truly one of the all-time greats, putting on one hell of a goddamn cage match in the main event in front of a packed house in a snowstorm, Starrcade's legacy was set, and it would just build from there. But I'm not here to just talk about Starrcade's legacy. I'm here to just talk about what Ric Flair meant to this ultimate event. I'm John Rhythm with my real honest thoughts on Ric Flair's Starrcade legacy from 1983 to 2000. So, yeah, full disclosure here, it's not really a pretty picture by the time we get to the end of this. And I'm going to talk about a few little bits of info in regards to the build to some of the earlier matches. But really, when you think about it, Ric Flair is identifiable with Starrcade. I mean, so is Dusty Rhodes, don't get me wrong. But Ric Flair, it's like how Hogan was identified with the earlier WrestleManias. Ric Flair is identified with the earlier Starrcades. And then you even get to the 1993 Starrcade. But boy, oh boy, it gets really sad later on. Let's talk about the 1983 Starrcade build. So, he was champion, Ric Flair was, for a number of months. I believe actually just over a year. And lost it to Harley Race in the summer of 1983. And this would be Harley Race's last run. Well, technically, he actually would win it back on a New Zealand tour in 1984 because they wanted to boost attendance. And the NWA didn't recognize that, even though by this point Jim Crockett Jr. pretty much was the NWA, because Bob fucking Geigel and his giant nose and ears certainly wasn't going to run anything all that well. Bob Geigel looked like a villager from Minecraft. You're welcome. Now I can't unsee it. But Harley Race was truly one of the all-time greats. I'm not saying he was a perfect person. Trust me, you can check out my review of the Dark Side of the Ring episode they did on him. And don't get me wrong, Ric Flair is pretty much a piece of shit for a lot of the shit that he has done. But as far as an in-ring performer, you can't take that away from him. You absolutely can't. And basically, Harley put out a $25,000 bounty to anybody that could take out Ric Flair because he did not want this man coming for him. Bob Orton Jr. and Dick Slater were able to collect on the bounty. And Ric Flair had to have neck surgery, and he was going to retire, and that's it. Gave him a neck brace, announced his retirement. But then, no. He's going to come after Harley. Gross. And he took out Orton Jr. and Dick Slater, and then called it a Flair for the Gold. And the lead up in this was talked about on the Dark Side of the Ring. Vince McMahon said, Harley, why don't you come up and see me, and I'll give you money, and we'll unify the titles, and you'll be my guy. Ha ha ha. Well, no, Harley couldn't do that. Harley had to look at himself in the mirror. Even though $250,000 was a lot of money, he had lost quite a bit of money buying into the St. Louis territory, which, after Sam Muchnick retired, had totally goddamn bottomed out. But yeah, basically, it was a layered card, but it was built all around Flair getting his win back over Harley in the passing of the torch situation. Race would turn him down. Vince said Vince would try to leg dive him in a bathroom. didn't work out all that well. And Starrcade would end up going off without a hitch, except for referee and former NWA champion Gene Knitsky nearly ruining the goddamn thing because he forgot how to be a referee and got his leg rolled on. Oh, my leg. Well, maybe you should have stayed out of the way. Gene Knitsky is truly, an all-time great, but come on. Like, fucking come on. Fun fact, by the way, I think his son lives, in Blaine, which is 75 miles from me. Or at least he was born there. I don't know if he still lives there. So anyway, it was a great match, as far as, except for Gene Knitsky. And even though Harley was near the end of his full-time run, near the end of his rope, like David Carradine in Bangkok, he was still able to put on a great match. Flair, the ultimate babyface at this point, the guy that they built the company around, he's bleeding, blood soaked through his goddamn hair. Box office wise, I believe they sold out or came close to selling out the Greensboro Coliseum, and even though it was a snowstorm and the closed circuit locations had some people, maybe it wasn't as successful had the weather been good, but it was still a big deal. Dusty wasn't even on the goddamn card, but they built it up where it's going to be Dusty and Flair at the next event. So Starrcade 83 was majorly successful, and had it not been for Race being the stand-up guy and being smart and everything and sticking around, okay, he might have gotten $250,000. I'm not saying that Vince wouldn't have paid him well, but Vince then could have just cut him in 1985, and what would Harley have done after that? That's it. So we basically are done with 1983 right there. It was a hell of a goddamn build, and it was the perfect launching point for Ric Flair's main event career, even though he was already on the ascent by that point. 1984, the Dusty Flair feud ramps up. Flair's a heel by this point. Flair turning heel during the lead-up was necessary. Joe Frazier was the referee for this $1 million challenge. Greensboro was sold out. What didn't end up helping this was the blood stoppage. The fans did not take to it all that well, really. And you watch the 1984 Starrcade, there are parts of it that are good, but it's rough. It's really fucking rough to get through. They would have a much better match the year after that, but it was a big moment, don't get me wrong, but 84 was a rebuilding period because Dusty had taken a lot of the talent from Florida and had gone to Crockett, and that would kind of gut Eddie Graham, and in addition to a lot of the stuff that Eddie Graham was going through would lead to, unfortunately, him taking his own life in January of 1985. Super Bowl Sunday, no less. But 1984 maybe wasn't as well received as 1983 critically, but it was still a big deal, and box office-wise, they were doing well. I don't know if it was a snowstorm that time, but 1985 is where things really kicked in, because they were at two locations. Now, we had, after the Great American Bash in 1985, where Flair, I believe, beat Nikita on September 29th in the Omni, Flair beat Nikita in a cage. Ivan Koloff showed up. It was a 2-on-1. Rose showed up to actually help Flair. And then, Ole and Arn came out, and basically Flair hit a knee drop, and they took out Dusty's leg and stuff like that. And that, I believe, is where Dustin and Cody talked about the leg, cast and everything, and him kayfabing all that stuff. But Dusty was basically, crippled, and he would have to come back. He would have to find a way to, you put hard times on me. I think that was where this was. I think it's where the promo was. I think it was in the lead up to this. And he, the idea was it was going to take place in two locations. It was going to take place in Greensboro and the Omni in Atlanta. And that was a big goddamn deal, two locations. It was clearly Vince, obviously gave them the idea. Oh, wait, Starrcade 85 was before WrestleMania 2. Because Vince just had to heap his ideas from somebody else. But Flair and Dusty being set, it was a good idea. And it certainly came off a lot better than it did in 1984. Dusty would win the title. The finish was disputed. And Flair would be, given the title back to basically lead up to the Great American Bash 1986, where sometime mid or late July, Dusty would beat Flair, and then would lose the title back a little bit later. So, right there, Starrcade is cooking. We got the two locations here. And 1986 was a great idea as far as, being the ultimate crowning of maybe another guy, or at least the, final push for a guy to be crowned later on. Magnum TA. Magnum TA and Nikita Koloff had just had that great series over the U.S. Championship. All this stuff was going on. They were cooking. Nikita was up 3-0. Magnum came back 3-3. Nikita would beat him. But the idea is Magnum and Jimmy Garvin were having a feud. So everything was going well. Let's talk about in the Dark Side of the Ring episode on Magnum TA. And that ended up actually causing an issue after his accident, Magnum TA's accident, not Jimmy Garvin's accident. His accident was losing his hair. But Magnum, was paralyzed. Now, he would eventually get to where he could walk a little bit, but now, unfortunately, he is pretty much confined to like one of those little motorized scooter deals. But hey, at least he can still get around. And they then decided, okay, what the hell are we going to do? Because this was the lead up here. Whether Magnum was going to win the championship or not, or be a disputed finish, is another story. But the idea is they had to create somebody else. And Nikita came out and basically, was going to be turned babyface. And it was a good idea. I cried for Magnum TA. And people were ready to take to Nikita. And they were still cooking. I still maintain that even if Magnum hadn't gotten injured, I don't think that anything could have prevented the bad money spending and the issues that Jim Crockett would end up having. Magnum would have helped business, but I don't think that Magnum was the end. I'm sorry. I just don't think that he was going to be the guy they could build around for the long term. For a few years, sure. But by 80, say he had not gotten injured by 89? I mean, I don't know. That's just me. But the match would end in a double DQ. And 86 maybe wasn't as well received as 85, but, given the circumstances and the cards they were dealt, I thought they did a pretty good job. So Flair, so far, he's 3-1. Well, actually, he's 2-1-1. Because that double DQ, I guess, would count kind of as a draw. So he's 2-1-1 because he lost in 85, but he won the first two. And then 1987, Crockett was expanding, having bought up the UWF for like $4-something million. Not integrating the roster very well. Bought Florida, when he probably just could have let Florida go on its ass. The Central States, even though I think by this point, he bought that in 86. I think Bob Geigel bought it back, and that didn't end up working. Harley was already in the WWF by 86. And spending like crazy. They were doing well if they stayed on the east side of the country. And even though they would draw well on the West Coast in some markets, running the Forum was stupid. Running in Oakland might have been one thing, but that would have cost a whole lot. And Great American Bash 1987 was successful. They were doing well. Jim Cornette talked about it on his podcast, as his books, because he was managing the Midnight Express at the time, even though he had injuries. I believe his... he had a knee injury that took him out for a bit, but wasn't going to miss a lot of payoffs. Only missed about 10 days when he probably should have missed more. Great American Bash 87. So you talk about 85 as a sole event. 86 was more of a ramp up. 87 was a good build up. And they were hitting some major stadiums. They were hitting some major cities. And because they didn't really have an opponent for Flair, they decided to have Ron Garvin, Rugged Ronnie Garvin beat him. Well, I mean, I know he wasn't Rugged Ronnie Garvin, but he's Hands of Stone Ronnie Garvin. Beats Flair in the lead up to Starrcade 87 because they wanted to build up anticipation. They had, in Chicago at the UIC Pavilion, I believe, if I remember right. So they took it out of Greensboro. That was the first mistake. Nobody really bought into Ron Garvin as champion. Not that they didn't buy into his talent, because his talent was incredible. He is truly one of the toughest. But they didn't. Yes, Flair won, and it was great that he got to win it there, but it was an odd move, and also they didn't give the Road Warriors the tag titles against Tully and Arn and other stuff going on. Sting was there. That was actually kind of cool. He was like part of a sixth man, I think. He was teaming up with Rick Steiner and Eddie Gilbert. I think it was against the Freebirds. Well, Michael Hayes was on the other side. I don't remember if it was the Freebirds. But the whole point is, Flair and Garvin were... it was a hard-hitting main event, and they always had great matches. But I don't think the fans bought Ron Garvin as champion. And this Survivor Series, unfortunately, would kind of be crippled because Vince decided to put on the 1987 Survivor Series, the first ever Survivor Series, opposite. Now, they put Starrcade a little bit earlier in the day, but Vince bluffed his way, basically telling the companies you won't get WrestleMania, which, if they had thought about it for 5 seconds, they would have realized he's shooting himself in the foot. We'll call his bluff. Then that wouldn't have worked, and Vince would have had to have just, taken that back. And he did. They got to carry WrestleMania anyway, but it hurt. I think it was like 20,000 pay-per-view buys when it could have been at least 80 to 100,000 pay-per-view buys. And had it been that, the money and the revenue would have done a whole lot to offset some of the losses. Not all the losses, but would have been done to set off some. And then, so Flair's the champion. You had the Bunkhouse Stampede. That didn't really go all that well, because that was in Nassau Coliseum. I believe Flair took on Road Warrior Hawk. And he would have, the Clash of Champions match against Sting. He would face off against Lex Luger at Great American Bash 88. All this build up. And in the lead up to Starrcade 88, not taking place this time on Thanksgiving, but on Christmas, or the day after Christmas, actually, Ted Turner would purchase Crockett Promotions from Jim Crockett and rechristen it WCW. And now we get to Starrcade 88, which I believe is at the Scope in Norfolk, Virginia. And, he had negotiated this, and Great American Bash 88 actually was carried on full-fledged pay-per-views, so Turner was able to help that. But Flair beat Luger in that dispute finish, all that. The crowd chanting bullshit at Great American Bash 88 was funny. So, yes, the day after Christmas, this is where, and they had only been running the company. Turner had only had his guys running the company for just under 2 months by this point. It drew, it was like 10 to 12,000 or something like that. It did 150,000 pay-per-view buys, if memory serves me correctly. But, him beating Luger was great. And they had other good matches there. They had, I believe, the Midnight Express against the Cornette's Midnight Express against Paul Heyman, or Paulie Dangerously's Midnight Express, Randy Rose, and Dennis Condrey against Lane and Eaton. And that made sense that they were doing that. And Flair and Luger, they always had really good matches. Flair could get the best out of Luger and could lead him, because Luger at that point, not that Luger was ever an awful athlete, but he was always somebody that needed to be led at least for a while. And they had a great series of matches as a way to cap it off. It wasn't the last time they faced off, but there you are. Now, Starrcade 88 kind of was the peak for a number of years as far as Starrcade in general. Also, it was a peak as far as what Flair would end up doing. So Flair was still a champ in 1989. Because he didn't end up losing it until like 1990. So it was ridiculous if you think about it. He, Jim Herd was running the company into the goddamn ground. They had the Future Shock tournament. It was Muta, Sting, Luger, and Flair in the singles. It was the Samoan SWAT team, Doom, Steiners, and the Road Warriors in the tag team. But it basically came down to Flair and Sting. Sting won. And then we got, the four, the symbol of excellence, the four, where Sting would end up having a brief alliance with Flair. Now, they had a really good finals match. It wasn't the best match they would end up having. Even a few months later, they would have a pretty good match. But, 1989, it wasn't the best idea. I mean, the singles tournament was one thing. Having a tag team tournament also, it got confusing. They would then have a tag team tournament, Pat O'Connor Memorial Tag Team Tournament at Starrcade 1990. But even if you look at the 1990 lead up, because believe me, once they get to about 1994, it ain't going to take very long for me to talk about the Starrcade legacy. You had, Wrestle War 90, Sting got injured just before. Doug Dillinger pulled him down too much. He snapped his ACL coming off a cage. And Capital Combat was against Luger. The return of RoboCop. Oh, that's RoboCop. Man, look at the strength of RoboCop. Poor JR. And then you have Great American Bash 1990. He loses to Sting. Sting's a champion. They didn't give Sting a lot of great feuds. They gave him the Black Scorpion feud, which was god-awful. They had so many people playing that goddamn thing. Flair was slotted in the last minute as the Black Scorpion. Put Flair in, he'll finish it. And what a letdown it was. It was a steel cage match, and you could tell, even though Flair was trying to work differently, you could tell just by the chin, just by the mannerisms, even though he was trying to work different. Everybody knew it was fucking Flair. And then he lost, he got unmasked. And Flair would win the title back in early 91, if I recall correctly. So Sting's title reign ended up just going up in smoke. And then after that, he would have the dispute with Jim Herd. Jim Herd would not give him the $25,000 deposit that he had put on the NWA title. He left right before Great American Bash 91. We want Flair. We want Flair. He would go in as a real world champion to WWF. Starrcade 91, Battle Bowl. Flair was in the WWF. And the Battle Bowl, Starrcade 91 might have been the low point. Because, man, it just felt like WCW was dead. 1992, Flair was still in the WWF. Flair had won the Royal Rumble and the WWF Championship earlier in the year. Face off against Randy Savage at Mania 8. Been part of, Will Warrior or Savage return at SummerSlam 92. Teamed up with Razor against Perfect and Savage at Survivor Series 92. And actually, you had Vader and Sting in the King of Cable final at Starrcade 92, Muta and Chono, and various others, and you had Battle Bowl. But Flair was in the WWF. 1993, he leaves soon after the Royal Rumble 93, losing to Mr. Perfect. Flair for the gold. Talk show. Teams up with Arn Anderson, faces up against the Hollywood Blondes. He was the NWA champion as well. He would beat Barry Windham. When they were getting away from the NWA. The thing with Rude that didn't end up turning out all that well, that was Fall Brawl 93. And Vader was a world champion, was a WCW world champion, and basically he was going to face Sid, and Sid was actually going to end up beating Vader, and that would have been interesting, but then Sid decided to get a little too vicious with his scissoring of Arn Anderson on a European tour. That's not a euphemism, it's just really amazing nobody died. So Flair was slotted in. They built this whole thing where Vader was like, okay, what do I get out of facing you, old man? I'll put my career on the line. Okay. So they did this nice build, Starrcade 93, building up all this stuff with Flair, with his family, in the limo with Mean Gene, building all this up. Incredible fucking match. Incredible match against Vader. I mean, I would argue pretty much the last great match that Flair had, that Flair had at Starrcade. And again, the rest of this is not going to take very long, but that match with Vader was fucking incredible. So, that was pretty much his peak. So he wasn't there in 91 and 92, and after basically we get to about 88, the Future Shock tournament, the Black Scorpion stuff. So yeah, Flair's legacy at Starrcade kind of starting to go up in smoke. 1994, if you remember Halloween Havoc 94, he was retired. And then Brutus Beefcake butchered the friendship, and then the Butcher, yes, Brutus Beefcake, took on Hogan in the main event of Starrcade and further proved that WCW deserved to go out of business because Hogan didn't want to do business with proper people. But yeah, he was retired, and he would show up a little bit later, including at Uncensored 95, when he would be drug around in a strap match, and Hogan would beat Vader by dragging Flair to all four corners. Yeah. 1995. So he wasn't there in 94, so he had already missed 3 out of the last 4 Starrcades. Granted, he was in our company for 91, 92. But he turned on Sting at Halloween Havoc 1995. Still one of the funniest goddamn moments I have seen in my life. I mean, Flair just did everything to convince Sting. And I mean, Sting knew and still got turned on because Sting was an idiot. And Savage won the vacated championship at World War III 1995. He would, this was after Giant and Hogan had their incredibly just ridiculous wrestle crap bad thing with the Yeti and all that, and the monster truck stuff before. And then the title would be held up, and Savage would win the 60-man 3-ring battle royal. And then he beat Luger and Sting, Flair did, in actually a pretty good triangle match. Honestly, it was a pretty good triangle match. Like, it was a little bit weird how they did the finish, but it's still pretty good. And then he beat Savage for the world title right after. Now, he would drop the title back to Savage, and they would do some hot potatoing. But that was a big deal because it showed that at least they still had some faith in Flair. And then we just get to ridiculousness. 1996, he was dealing with horseman business, and he didn't wrestle. Now, I can't remember if he was actually hurt at this point, because I think he was. I think he was. But he was dealing with horseman business, so that was the Piper Hogan, main event, and Ultimo Dragon and Dean Malenko, I think. And then you had Ray and Jushin Thunder Liger, and you had various other matches on the card to offset the fact that Piper and Hogan had the crowd eating out of their hands, but oh boy. 1997, he didn't wrestle either. He had feuded with Kurt Hennig in the lead-up, but they didn't want to go anywhere with that, and he was still having issues. He would wrestle at Sold Out 98. I mean, Starrcade 97 needed all the help it could get because of what they did with Sting, because he didn't tan enough, and they didn't have Flair wrestle on the goddamn card. But they had Vincent wrestle on the goddamn card. And bless Virgil, but no. 1997 was done. 1998, he lost to Eric Bischoff. That is the end of Ric Flair's run at Starrcade. He started by beating Harley Race in 1983. He beat Vader in 1993. He even won the world title in 1995. And 3 years later, he lost to Eric fucking Bischoff. And yes, it was full of shenanigans, bullshit, and stuff like that. And he would win the presidency just a little bit after that. But come on. He lost to Bischoff. Of all fucking people. That was when WCW was just spiraling the fuck out of control at that point. But 1998, where Goldberg lost his streak, and the 1998 Starrcade wasn't really all that great, even though the stuff with Kidman was fine. But yeah, it was a little bit better than 97 until the finish, and the people popped. But then the ratings popped because they started cascading down by the time we got to April or May, just a few months after WCW was toast. He was buried in the desert in November of 99, so he wasn't Starrcade 99, which was just as well because that event was a fiasco. He had been off TV for months in 2000 and would return with the Magnificent Seven, and that was at least a storyline that was something. They were trying to right the ship, but by that point the ship wasn't sinking. The ship was at the bottom of the damn ocean. They were just trying to swim up. So yeah, that's Ric Flair's Starrcade legacy. 1983, 84, 85. So yeah, I mean, he went 2-1-1, and then at 87 he would go 3-1-1, and then he would go 4-1-1. He would lose to Sting. At the next two events, he would go 4-3-1, and then he would end up going 5-3-1. He would go 6-3-1, actually 7-3-1 because he won two matches. And 95, and then would end up going 7-4-1 at for Starrcade because he lost to Eric fucking Bischoff. Woo! Yeah, I don't really know what the hell they were thinking there, but Flair's high should be remembered. Obviously, people should remember that he has been a shitbag to a lot of people for a lot of reasons I will not go into here, but for pure in-ring performance, he is one of the all-time greats. But man, when you break down that Starrcade legacy, it really doesn't sound all that great, does it? Hogan's legacy at WrestleMania seems much more intact. When he didn't lose that often. Anyway, so yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments. What's your favorite Ric Flair match moment from Starrcade? Like, share, subscribe, Twitter, Letterboxd, Blue Sky handles in the description. I'm John Ritland. I'll see you soon.